The church bells tolled low and heavy, their sound rolling like thunder across the gray sky. Black umbrellas bent beneath a soft drizzle as mourners moved like shadows around the freshly dug grave. I stood among them, my expression carved in stillness, but inside me, something far colder than grief stirred. My father's coffin was lowered with the dignity he deserved. Yet whispers swirled, not of loss, but of inheritance. My brother's hand lingered too long on the attorney's shoulder, his eyes bright not with mourning, but with triumph. Even before the soil touched the casket, I understood. This funeral was not just an end, but the beginning of betrayal. When the will was read, the truth unraveled with surgical cruelty. What should have been mine by right, my father's company, the estate, the legacy he had promised, was spoken into my brother's hands. Page after page bore signatures I recognized, but words I did not. He watched me from across the polished oak table, his lips curving in a smile as smooth as poison. "Father trusted me to carry the family forward," he said, voice thick with false humility, while his gaze dared me to object. The room applauded his loyalty, blind to the theft dressed in legal ink. I remained silent. Rage coiled like fire in my chest, but I gave no sign of it. I would not weep nor beg. He had won only the surface battle. Behind the mask of composure, fury burned steady, controlled. Each nod I gave, each word of congratulations I offered, was a blade sharpened in patience. He mistook my quiet for weakness, not knowing that silence is where storms gather their strength. I studied him, every gesture, every careless boast he offered over wine and applause. He laughed too easily, already intoxicated by his stolen power. He thought the crown secure upon his head. Yet I knew crowns made of ash always crumble. Hints began to slip through the cracks of his arrogance. A whisper from a clerk who avoided my eyes. A document referenced but never shown. My father's old confidant, once cast aside, hinted that the story was not yet whole. My brother's empire was built on a foundation that might not hold the weight he placed upon it. He believed himself untouchable, but even shadows cannot bury the truth forever. And then, like a candle flaring in the dark, I discovered it. A rumor of a second will, a testament written not in the dying days of my father's life, but in the prime of his clarity. Its existence had been buried, hidden by fear or convenience, but I knew it was real. The possibility alone was enough to steady my resolve. My grief became a weapon, my patience a blade honed on betrayal. My brother believed he had silenced the past, but I would raise it like a ghost against him. He stole my father's legacy. Now I would take his soul's peace in return. If you are drawn into this story of revenge and betrayal, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping tales. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was already within me, waiting for the right moment to break. Brothers born of the same blood often carry different weights of inheritance, one of character, the other of greed. From childhood, my brother had been the louder voice, the more demanding presence, his arrogance carrying him through doors others had to knock upon. I, in contrast, lived in the quiet corners, listening more than speaking, calculating where he blustered. What he mistook for weakness was something far sharper, patience. Yet even I could not ignore the widening rift between us, the silent war that grew with every word of pride he spoke, and every shadow of ambition that lingered in his eyes. When our father's health began to falter, that rift became a chasm. His once commanding figure shrank with each passing week, strength bleeding away like sand slipping through an hourglass. And as his body withered, so too did the bonds that should have bound us together. My brother wasted no time. He whispered into the old man's ear, feeding him promises of devotion, of loyalty, of carrying the family legacy forward. In truth, his loyalty extended no further than his reflection in the mirror. I watched from the doorway as he sat at our father's bedside, clutching his hand with false tenderness, and knew each word was a seed of manipulation. Our mother, who might once have been the balancing force, offered no resistance. Fragile in body and spirit, or gone entirely, depending on how one views silence, she left me standing alone against a tide of betrayal. There was no comfort, no gentle voice to remind me that blood was thicker than ambition. Only the cold reality that I faced this storm without her shield. The family home echoed with absence, its walls bearing witness to a play where only 2 actors remained, and one had already begun rewriting the script. My brother became a master of performance, parading himself as the dutiful son. He brought tea to our father, helped him walk, read aloud the old business journals he once scorned. To outsiders, it was devotion made flesh. But behind the curtain, I saw the hand that pulled the strings. He sowed doubts against me with subtle precision, little lies spoken with sighs, glances heavy with fabricated concern. He doesn't visit enough. He seems distant. Perhaps he isn't ready for the responsibility. Each word was poison, sweetened with a smile, and in the silence of my restraint, those lies rooted deep. It wasn't long before the whispers grew louder, sharper, until they cut at my reputation. Family friends stopped meeting my gaze. Relatives repeated his words without questioning them. I became the subject of rumors I hadn't earned, the villain of a story I hadn't written. The more I stayed silent, the stronger the narrative grew. He thrived on it, watching me sink under the weight of gossip, while he stood above, the picture of filial devotion. His victory was not yet complete, but the stage was set. The final act required an accomplice, and he found one in my father's lawyer. A man who once guided us through contracts and deeds now moved like a shadow beneath my brother's command. Meetings took place behind closed doors, papers slid across polished desks in secrecy. I caught fragments, hints of amendments, suggestions of restructuring, and knew that with each stroke of the pen, my place was being erased. My brother was tightening his grip, weaving a legal snare that would secure his triumph under the guise of justice. When the will was read, the performance ended in applause. For him, not for me. The lawyer's voice was steady as he declared my brother the sole heir. Every property, every business, every legacy my father had built passed into his hands, while I was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of betrayal. My brother's smirk, barely concealed beneath feigned solemnity, was the only truth in that room. The inheritance was stolen, but worse was the dignity stripped from me in silence. Yet I did not rage. I did not slam my fist or cry out against the injustice. I folded my anger into silence, locked it behind a mask of composure so complete it unsettled him. Rage is loud, revenge is quiet. And I chose the latter. While others believed I accepted defeat, I felt the heat of fury cooling into something sharper, strategy. My brother had won the battle he could see, but I was preparing for the war he could not. And then came the whisper. On his last night, my father's voice, weak, trembling yet unmistakable, slipped past my brother's charade. Or perhaps it was the letter, found hidden among his most trusted belongings, carrying words no lawyer had touched. Either way, it was his final act, a message from beyond decline. Not everything is as it seems, he told me. A puzzle left behind, a key hidden in the ashes of betrayal. My brother believed the story was over, but I now held the first page of a new chapter. The war he thought won had only just begun. The lies began to show themselves not in grand revelations, but in the smallest cracks. A misplaced figure in an estate ledger, an offhand remark from a clerk that contradicted my brother's polished story. At first, they seemed like nothing more than accidents of memory, but together they formed a pattern. Each inconsistency was a thread, and when I tugged at them, I felt the weave of his deception begin to fray. My father's estate, which had appeared sealed and settled, now whispered that it had been tampered with. The deeper I followed, the darker the shadows grew. Pages bore signatures that did not flow with the same weight of my father's hand. Contracts appeared rushed, their ink too fresh, their witnesses too scarce. Money had shifted in silence, funneled into accounts hidden under false names. Behind every polished word my brother spoke stood a forged document, a clandestine meeting, or a silenced witness. Fraud did not lurk in the corners, it ruled at the very center of his empire. And as his lies sprawled wider, I no longer saw him as clever. I saw him as careless. In those nights of searching, my father's voice returned to me, not in spirit, but in memory. Inheritance is not measured in gold, but in truth, he once told me. He had taught me that the strength of a man's name carried further than the weight of his purse. I had dismissed those words as the philosophies of age. Now they became my compass. My brother thought he had stolen everything, but what he stole was nothing compared to what he tried to bury. The truth my father valued above all else. With that truth as my anchor, I began to move carefully, reaching out to those who had once stood by him. Old friends, forgotten allies, those my brother had cast aside in his rush for dominance. Some hesitated, fearful of his growing power. Others remembered debts unpaid, loyalty unbroken. Slowly, quietly, they returned to me, not with declarations, but with silence that carried meaning. Together, our silence became strength, a shadowed alliance beneath his oblivious gaze. Piece by piece, I gathered what I needed: documents hidden in drawers, receipts left unsigned, whispers of bribes offered and taken. Every betrayal he committed became a stone I placed into my arsenal. I did not rush. I collected with the patience of a predator, building a case not of emotion, but of undeniable fact. Each night, I laid the pieces before me, constructing a picture so complete that even his arrogance would not escape it. And arrogant he was. Flush with stolen wealth, he flaunted his power as though he were untouchable. He mocked me openly, laughed at my restraint. All the patience in the world won't change what's mine, he sneered, toasting his own reflection as though it were his only equal. In his laughter, I saw the fatal flaw. He no longer guarded himself. He believed the crown secure, never realizing it sat upon a crumbling throne. I endured every insult with the calm of a man sharpening a blade in secret. My smile became my weapon, my silence the sheath that hid it. He looked into my eyes and saw surrender, never the fire that smoldered beneath. Each moment of his ridicule only tightened the knot of his downfall. I would not give him the satisfaction of reaction, I would give him the devastation of revelation. And then, at last, I found it, the whisper I had been chasing. A second will, written before his hands had grown weak, before the lawyer had been bought, before the lies were woven thick. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. My father's true testament. The will my brother thought he buried was only the first grave. The real one had been waiting, preserved like a blade sheathed in silence, waiting for me to draw it. His empire was built on theft. Mine would rise on truth, and truth once uncovered does not die. He had always believed himself untouchable. Nights of whiskey-fueled bravado left him loose-lipped, careless. One evening, slouched back in his leather chair, He let slip fragments of truths that should have remained buried. Numbers, hidden accounts, names of accomplices, all spilled out in a haze of arrogance. To him, it was nothing but drunken boasting. But to the one listening quietly, it was a map, an outline of every fracture in the empire he had stolen. Pride had loosened his tongue, and with each word, he unknowingly planted the seeds of his own undoing. The first crack appeared where he least expected it. A minor legal oversight, a single missing clause in the handling of their late father's estate, became the fissure through which everything could collapse. He had been meticulous in his schemes, hiding behind lawyers and documents drafted to his favor. But arrogance breeds sloppiness. And here, in the dense language of inheritance law, the protagonist found the flaw. A tiny gap, overlooked and forgotten, that would not only weaken his claim, but make him vulnerable to a weapon he thought safely buried: the second will. That ghost rose from the shadows with perfect timing. Their father, cautious to the very end, had written a safeguard, an alternate will, ironclad and untouchable, sealed away in the hands of a lawyer the brother had dismissed as irrelevant. For years, it had slept in silence, gathering dust, waiting for the day when it would awaken. And now, as the protagonist pieced together the brother's mistakes, the hidden document glowed like a blade unsheathed. Its contents left no room for interpretation. The empire that the brother had claimed as his own was never truly his. It belonged elsewhere, destined for hands he had tried to erase. Yet to wield such a weapon required patience. Timing was everything. To reveal it too soon would dull its edge. The protagonist planned carefully, holding the document close, waiting for the moment when arrogance would be highest, when laughter would be loudest, and when humiliation would cut deepest. The stage was being set, and each day the brother strutted with his false sense of victory, only made the inevitable collapse more delicious. The unveiling would not be in silence. It would be in front of those he most wanted to impress: his allies, his advisors, his circle of sycophants. The reveal would not merely destroy his claim, it would shatter his pride. And whispers began to drift through the corridors long before the blow landed. Servants exchanged glances. Old business partners muttered questions. A trace of unease seeped into conversations where the brother's name once commanded fear. Yet he dismissed it all with a sneer, brushing away the murmurs as baseless gossip. His laughter echoed through the halls, bold and booming, blind to the reality stalking just behind him. The storm had already begun, but he stood smug beneath darkening skies, convinced he could not be touched. Through it all, the protagonist waited with the patience of a hunter. Every glance, every careless smirk from the brother was observed and catalogued, feeding the quiet resolve within. They tightened the noose with silence, each step hidden beneath calm composure. No anger, no wild gestures, no emotional eruption, just stillness, just calculation. And beneath that calm, the weight of justice waited, heavy and inescapable. The brother had built his fortress on stolen stone, but now its foundations trembled. The summons arrived like a thunderclap. A formal letter, crisp and cold, demanding the brother's presence for the second reading of their father's will. At first, he laughed. Another technicality, another petty attempt to undermine his reign. But when he saw the seal, when he read the name of the lawyer entrusted with the hidden document, his confidence cracked. For the first time, uncertainty shadowed his face. He realized too late that the empire he had claimed with such arrogance was never truly his. The ground shifted beneath his feet, and in that moment, the hunter's silence broke into the faintest smile. The trap had closed, and there was no way out. The air in the room was thick, heavy with tension that no one dared to break. Relatives shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, whispering only with their eyes. Everyone knew this was not an ordinary gathering. The summons for the second reading of the will had spread through the family like a storm warning, stirring dread and curiosity in equal measure. At the center of it all sat the brother, draped in his confidence as though it were a cloak no one could pierce. He leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk, glancing at the others as though they were merely spectators in a play he had already scripted. He believed victory was his. He had ruled over the estate for months, boasting of his control, flaunting wealth that wasn't truly his, and silencing anyone who dared question his claim. His arrogance radiated with every breath, and to him, today was nothing but a formality. The second reading, he thought, would end like the first, his name triumphant, his enemies crushed by the weight of his legal maneuvers. That certainty wrapped around him like armor, blinding him to the storm waiting just beyond the door. When the lawyer cleared his throat, silence rippled through the room. His voice was measured, steady, but the weight of his words struck like a hammer. He read the terms of the father's true will, the one hidden, sealed, and airtight. Line after line stripped the illusion apart. Every real asset, every piece of land, every business title flowed not into the brother's grasping hands, but into the hands of the one he had mocked, dismissed, and betrayed. The room froze. Gasps slipped through clenched lips. The brother's smirk faltered just slightly, but enough for those watching closely to see the first fracture. Then came the letter. The lawyer unfolded a page written in their father's hand, words carved from the grave with a clarity that pierced through every lie. In it, the father spoke not of affection, but of disappointment, his knowledge of the brother's manipulations, his disgust at the greed that had poisoned the family bond. He wrote of trust broken, of schemes unworthy of the name he carried, and he made it plain that his true heir was not the one who clawed at power, but the one who had endured in silence, waiting. Each word stripped away the brother's facade, leaving nothing but the raw truth exposed before the entire family. The collapse began in his eyes. His confident grin melted into disbelief, then twisted into panic. He shook his head, stammered objections, but the lawyer's voice rolled on, unstoppable, unyielding. Papers stamped, signatures sealed, nothing left to contest. The empire he thought secure crumbled in his hands like ash. The more he fought, the weaker he looked. The more he denied, the clearer his guilt became. Every ounce of arrogance burned away until all that remained was a man cornered by his own deceit. Through it all, the protagonist sat in perfect silence. No smile, no triumphant sneer, only stillness. That composure was sharper than any outburst could ever be. The absence of reaction was itself a weapon, a reminder that justice did not need theatrics. Silence weighed heavier than words, and the brother felt it pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. He searched for anger, for an explosion that might give him footing, but found nothing. Only the cold, unflinching gaze of the one he had underestimated. And then the trap closed fully. In front of relatives, allies, and family elders, the reality became undeniable. The wealth, the reputation, the power he had clung to slipped through his grasp. His name, once spoken with respect, now carried shame. Contracts dissolved, respect turned to pity, and the fortress he had built on stolen foundations collapsed in plain view. There was no dignity left to salvage. His final defense was a whisper, trembling and desperate. This can't be happening. But it was. The words fell into the silence, echoing back at him with the weight of inevitability. Shoulders hunched, eyes wide, He finally faced the truth he had spent his life running from. The room no longer feared him. They looked past him, toward the one who had endured quietly, the one now holding everything he once claimed. The revenge was complete, not in shouts or violence, but in the quiet ruin of a man who had believed himself untouchable. And as the room emptied, the protagonist rose with steady grace, leaving the wreckage behind. They did not gloat, did not linger, did not speak a word. Success itself was the final blow, and silence the most merciless victory. The silence of the family was louder than any accusation. Once, they had gathered around the brother, laughing at his jokes, listening to his boasts, indulging his arrogance. Now, their eyes carried nothing but disdain. Aunts who once praised his charm refused to meet his gaze. Cousins who once followed his lead whispered behind closed doors. Even the elders, those who had tolerated his pride for too long, turned away. His reputation, once his armor, lay in ashes at his feet. No one defended him. No one stood beside him. He was left to sit in his own shame, a king without subjects, a man stripped of the illusion he thought was power. The isolation did not stop at the family. Beyond those walls, the empire he flaunted so proudly began to collapse. Business partners who once sought his favor now withdrew their hands, unwilling to be tainted by scandal. Meetings were canceled, contracts dissolved, calls went unanswered. Doors that had opened at his command now slammed shut in his face. He had built his kingdom on borrowed respect and stolen wealth, but without the illusion of legitimacy, it crumbled overnight. His arrogance had burned every bridge, and now he stood powerless, abandoned, watching as his empire turned to dust. But ruin rarely travels alone. The law began to circle, shadows lengthening with every passing day. With the father's letter and the second will as evidence, whispers of fraud reached officials who wasted no time digging deeper. Accounts were examined, transactions scrutinized. What he had once hidden beneath layers of manipulation now lay bare, exposed to the light. Each envelope, each signature, each forged clause became another chain tightening around him. For the first time, it was not family judgment he feared, but the cold hand of justice closing in. His fall was no longer social. It was legal, inescapable, and merciless. Side by side, two fates unfolded. The brother sank deeper into desperation, clinging to excuses, spiraling into panic, begging for mercy where none remained. Meanwhile, the protagonist rose, not with noise, not with boastful displays, but with quiet strength. They carried themselves with composure, their presence steady and calm, earning respect not through fear, but through dignity. While one sibling fell into shadows, the other stepped into the light, the contrast too stark for anyone to miss. It was a story of the same blood, but two entirely different legacies. The true gift was never the wealth alone. It was integrity, the inheritance their father had safeguarded not on paper, but in spirit. By leaving his fortune to the one who had endured with patience and honor, he had ensured the family's future rested in steady hands. The protagonist did not simply claim assets. They claimed the moral authority to lead, to heal, to restore what had been broken. That was the father's true gift, the assurance that the family name would be rebuilt not on lies, but on truth. And so, when victory was finally theirs, it was not triumph they sought. There was no gloating, no cruel laughter, no hunger for further humiliation. The protagonist looked at the broken figure of their brother and felt no satisfaction in his ruin, only closure. They turned away in silence, carrying their dignity as their only answer. Revenge was never about shouting down an enemy. It was about restoring balance, and that balance had been achieved. In the end, there was only one truth left to speak, one final word that sealed everything. He had stolen the inheritance once, twisting law and family against its rightful heir. But wealth could be stolen, documents forged, power claimed. What he never owned, and what ultimately destroyed him, was the mind that outplayed him. He stole the inheritance once, the protagonist thought, their steps steady as they left the ruins behind. But what he never owned was the mind that destroyed him.